Hello, this is lecture 13 for Healthcare Finance 1 at the UNT Health Fort Worth Health Science Center. We're going to get right into chapter 13's lecture. We're going to talk about assessing how to do a financial condition, which will include financial statement analysis. In the previous couple of chapters, we've looked over financial statements like the cash flow statement, the balance sheet, and the income statement. We're going to be analyzing those and pieces of those in this lecture. This also includes an operating analysis as well as ratio analysis so that we can look at comparative trends and analyze those trends to see where we're at, what we've seen in the past, and how we move forward. We'll talk about a DuPont analysis. We'll look at some other techniques, some limitations to these, and some KPI and dashboards. Most important factor for any business's success is to have that financial condition. Remember earlier in the semester I talked about how everything that revolves around the business has to revolve around the business's goals, and a big part of that is the financial goals of the organization. So your financial condition assessment must think of that, but it also must try to understand whether or not the financial capacity to meet its mission is included in that goal. So those results often focus on the business financial strengths and weaknesses. And in your other classes, you've learned about a SWOT assessment. Well, a SWOT assessment or a SWOT analysis can be placed on the financial piece as well. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but just know that it can happen. All right. The financial conditions of a business are like the organization's vital signs, literally the pulse, the heart rate, the respiratory rate, the temperature, the pulse oximetry in clinical terms equates to vital signs like what ratio provides you what information and which one of the cash flows or which one of the financial statements or financial sheets gives you the right information for these analyses. Strong financial condition in your business allows flexibility to invest and grow. And it also allows you to have flexibility to change and be agile and maneuver should something pop up that you weren't really expecting. A weak condition does just the opposite. It requires that you maybe make reactive cuts, or there might be delays in growth or delays in products or delays in services or even delays in purchasing equipment or things. Here's a little video over financial statement analysis. We'll let you watch that and then pick back up.
Financial analysis includes a number of different steps in order to get a complete picture regarding the performance of a company. The starting point for this exercise is the company's financial statements, in particular its income statement, its balance sheet, and its statement of cash flows. Once we have the financial statements, then we can start performing trend and ratio analysis. For the income statement, this relates to the vertical and horizontal analysis we will be performing throughout this module. We also use the balance sheet and cash flow statement to undergo further ratio analysis. To do this, we look at trends, which are covered in modules 2 and 3 of this course. Once we perform the analysis, we interpret the results. We will do this throughout each module of the course as we go. In addition, in Module 4, we will piece it all together with a pyramid of ratios. We will be able to use this pyramid to piece it all together and have a solid understanding of how the company is performing. When using ratio analysis, there are two basic groups. The first is performance ratios, and the second is financial leverage ratios. Performance ratios speak to how a company is doing. How profitable is it, and how efficiently is it being run? Financial leverage ratios speak to the financial condition of the company. How liquid is it, and how solvent is it? For this module, we are only focusing on the performance ratios. As we analyze the income statement, it is the profitability ratios that we pay attention to. By completing the exercises in this section, You will have a thorough grasp of how to perform profitability ratio analysis of a company's income statement.
All right, so a good little video that does the overview. Here's another video that talks about financial analysis as well.
Financial analysis is the process of assessing a company's performance and making recommendations about how it's going to perform in the future. Financial analysts carry out their work in Excel and use historical data to then generate projections about the future.
So just to quickly pause here and kind of comment on what he said, financial analysis involves using financial data to assess a company's performance and make recommendations. Earlier in the semester, we talked about we're wanting you to become better decision makers in your organization through analysis of financial status. And this is exactly what he's saying there. Also, he mentions the financial work being done in Excel, which is true. There's a lot of work that does occur in Excel, but sometimes there's other formats that places and organizations use. Nowadays, there are tons of AI intuitive softwares that can take those financial documents and things that are in Excel, and they can put them into the new platform that the AI has, and it can create a really nice data visualization and analysis tool to help you understand exactly where you are and present a visual graphic of
Let's
that.
look at the most common types of financial analysis and the ones that we're going to discuss in this tutorial. These 12 types are extremely important, and we're going to outline what each of them are and how they're useful. Let's begin with a vertical analysis. In vertical analysis, an analyst will take each line item on the income statement and divide it into revenue to see it as a percentage. This enables the analyst to compare the company to other companies in the same industry, which is why it's also called a common-sized income statement. So this is a very good first step in comparing companies.
So keep in mind that an analysis is literally just a comparison. We're doing a comparison over something, over some sort of time, or to another number, another like number at a different time or something like that. But an analysis is just a comparison, which is why we talk about taking components of the income statement and dividing them by revenue to express a percentage. That's what that is it's taking that number or dividing it by some other number to get a percentage so that we know kind of where we are.
Another type of analysis is horizontal. With horizontal, instead of moving up and down the income statement, we move across the income statement, comparing year-over-year performance. It's typically done with 3 to 5 years of historical data, and the numbers are divided into each other to express them as a growth rate, either up or down, year over year.
So as it talks about doing a horizontal analysis year to year to year, what we call that in the business world is year over year or month over month, depending on which we're looking at. Sometimes we break it down even further and do current month, current year, and then current month, previous year one, current month, previous year two, just to see where we are for the month based on that month several years behind. So sometimes particularly in retail businesses and even in healthcare, the business is seasonal. So like they can understand where they are in that month compared to the last year's point at the same month. For instance, when the cold and flu season hits, they know that their volume is going to increase by X amount every year during the month of December. And they can look at their monthly numbers and say, okay, this December it was this, last December it was this, the December before that it was crazy off the charts. The example I would give there is during COVID. When that first hit and they were looking at monthly numbers, year over year, monthly numbers, current month, previous year one, previous year two, et cetera, they were looking at that and the COVID numbers were just astronomically different.
This is commonly referred to as trend analysis. Leverage ratios are very important to analyze for a company. It tells the analyst how much debt or equity a business has relative to its assets or to some type of cash flow generation. Below are 4 examples of commonly used leverage ratios that an analyst should know about. Growth rates are another important type of financial analysis. Based on historical results, an analyst can forecast how it expects a company to grow in the future. Common examples are listed on the right here, with the most common being year-over-year growth rates, regression analysis, bottom-up and top-down approaches to forecasting. Profitability analysis looks at how much income a business earns relative to its revenue. You can look at gross profit, EBITDA, EBIT, and net profit margins to see how much earning a company can generate. Liquidity analysis is also very important. Liquidity analysis looks at the short-term ability of a company to meet its obligations. You can look at the current ratio, perform an asset test, the cash ratio, and look at net working capital to understand how easily a company can meet its obligations that are due in less than a year.
Now keep in mind, we've talked about liquidity and what that means. Cash is king, and liquidity is the ability for you to have enough cash to pay off your expenses. And you can put those in ratios so that you understand kind of where you are. And when you compare it to last year or this year, or even you want to forecast that and push it out over the next year or next 2 or 3 years, you have an idea of your cash status and how flexible and maneuverable you are going to be. And that's a really good thing to know kind of in the back of your mind, particularly if you're planning on a particular growth, or if you have something in mind that you want to buy or purchase, or if you forecast or foresee a problem, such as, again, the pandemic. That was hard to predict, but we were able to take the analysis that we've done here in the current ratios and help us understand what our situation was and what it could look like going forward from that.
Efficiency analysis is very important and looks at a company's balance sheet as well as its ability to generate revenue. So essentially, it looks at a company's assets and its sales and tries to assess how well it's using those assets to generate revenue. Cash flow analysis, there is an expression that cash is king, and this is very true in finance. Thus, cash flow analysis needs to be performed in addition to profitability analysis. Looking at the cash flow statement will give a clear picture of how much cash a company is generating. On the right here are 4 common cash flow metrics that an analyst should use to analyze a business. Rates of return are very important for investors. When they make an investment, they want to get a return on it, or an ROI. There are many types of ways to measure return. Common examples are listed below, with internal rate of return being the ultimate measure of return for an investor. Valuation analysis is when an analyst attempts to value a company based on cash flow or other metrics. Let's look at the main methods of valuing a business or an asset. There is the cost approach, the market approach, and the discounted cash flow approach, or intrinsic value. In CFI's courses, we focus mostly on the market approach and the intrinsic value approach. These are the most common methods used by industry practitioners. Scenario and sensitivity analysis can be layered on top of valuation work, and it looks to understand how sensitive the value of a company is relative to changes in operating assumptions. Scenarios can be used to understand how a business might perform in different future states of the world. And finally, variance analysis looks to assess how a company performed relative to its budget or to a forecast. It seeks to understand, using root cause analysis, what was the lead or the cause of over and underperformance. A waterfall chart, as shown on the right here, can help summarize the impact of various assumptions in the results that the company achieved. At the end of the day, all 12 methods of financial analysis are very important and should all be done together in conjunction with each other so that you can have a full picture of a business's performance and how you expect it to perform in the future. Thank you so much for joining us for this tutorial on financial analysis.
So you can see here through the YouTube link this CFI and how to build a financial dashboard in Excel. This would be really interesting to watch. It's a pretty good video. It's of course beyond the extent of this class, but it would be really good for you guys to understand how to build a dashboard. And we'll talk about dashboards here in just a little bit towards the next or the end of the class. So, all right. So we're going to talk about financial statement analysis in this lecture. We're going to focus on the information that's in a business's financial statements. And our goal is going to be assessing the financial condition of the business. That's the goal. We just want to see where we're at. We're going to assess everything. And right now, we're not going to focus so much on the strategy based on what we do find, but we want to focus on what that assessment is, okay, and how we get to assessment. Later on, maybe in the class for the rest of the semester, or maybe even next year when you're in Healthcare Finance 2, you will take this assessment that you have and you will begin to build strategy on how to use the assessments and the financial documents to make better decisions for your business. We'll also talk about an operating analysis that focuses on operating data with the goal of explaining the financial situation or the financial condition. Again, later on, we'll work on building strategy. Now, to make sure that we understand how we're going to do this, to illustrate those financial statement analysis, you've got to consider the following data. Not-for-profit Riverside Memorial. This is an example in your book, and all the data in this next few slides or the next slides are going to be in thousands of dollars when you see them. Okay, so here's an example. This is Riverside's income statement. You can obviously tell 2015 to 2016 is the year we're looking at here, and it has all of the columns there on the left, or all the descriptions on the left, and then the money values on the right. And we put this together just like you've seen and like we talked about in the previous classes about an income statement where everything is there, and at the bottom you have your net income. Okay, notice in here you have operating income and non-operating income as well, and remember what we talked about on how those two actually differ. The balance sheets for their assets, this was the assets, again, same years, 2016, 2015, cash and cash equivalents. Remember that these are all listed in order of how quick they can be liquidated. All right, so cash and cash equivalents can be liquidated first. Same thing with short-term investments, they would come next, and then your accounts receivable could come back after that. All right, and you can see that they have all of these different assets all the way down to total assets. Then their liabilities and equity. Okay, they have accounts payable, accrued expenses, notes payable, current portion of their long-term debt. That just means what they've got 12 months right now, how much long-term debt they have in those particular years. Remember that long-term debt is anything that would be paid off in over 12 months or over a year, but current is that 12-month period. What does it look like for that 12-month period of that long-term debt? Okay, and then they have capital lease obligations, which are literally just leases on capital purchases, property, plant, and equipment, things like that. So their 2016 cash flow statement, part 1, you can see cash flow from operating activities, and then that's totaled up to get net cash flow, and then they have investing activities, and then next they'll have financing activities. Think back to that thing that I mentioned in class or in an earlier part where we talk about operating, investing, and financing activities inside of your cash flow. All right. So we now analyze this cash flow, and we're going to look at the operating and non-operating income. So the net income provided, it was about $11 million in cash flow in 2016. Riverside invested $4.3 million in new fixed assets and $2 million in short-term securities. So the $4.3 million in new fixed assets, remember a fixed asset was something that is attached to the building, it couldn't be moved. So property, plant, and equipment that's not just easily picked up and moved. And then also the $2.0 million in short-term securities, that short-term investments that they're using. So that's the investment side of their OOF or their OIF, operating, investing, and financing activities. And they also paid $5.5 million in short-term and long-term debt financing. Notice this is set up so that it's operating, investing, and financing, just like we talked about. Okay, the cash flow matters more than the net income in healthcare. And I'd like for you to think of that on your own, why you think that matters. We've talked about cash flow before. We know what net income is, but tell me, or at least think to yourself, why cash flow matters more than net income. Delayed payments from insurances can cause problems here. Not everybody pays as soon as they've given as soon as you give your service to that patient or that customer. So if we're going to have delayed payments coming in, that could affect our cash flow. And positive operating cash flow plus new investment equals stability. That generally signifies that your company is stable. If you've got a positive operating cash flow and you're making new investments either in your either in your company, or if you are making investments into short-term or even long-term investment securities. The financial ratio analysis is a technique used in financial condition analysis that combines value from the financial statements to create a single number that is easily interpretable economic significance, so we can tell what the significance of our financial situation is. It also facilitates comparisons. Now, ratios standardize performance across different hospitals. It doesn't have to be hospitals. It can be different businesses or different departments or even different organizations. But this is a way that we can compare different things. And we focus on interpretation, not memorization. We can always look back at these documents and understand where we are. Again, we're going to work on strategy later on, but we're working on putting these financial statements together to create an analysis so that we can interpret it, not memorialize it or memorize it, all right? And using those ratios with trends and benchmarks for meaning. We're going to look at those trends and those benchmarks to see how we're doing. It's a way to compare our business to others. So when we talk about interpreting the ratios, a single value ratio has little meaning, all right? Example, your total profit margin, 7.5%, is difficult to assess without the context. If you don't know the other parts and pieces of this, total profit margin is just one tiny little piece that you can find, but you don't know, okay? The trend, though, however, shows direction, all right? And benchmarks show relative strength. Thus, two techniques are used to help interpret those numbers or the numbers: a trend analysis, which is its ratio values over time, and a comparative analysis, which is the organization's ratio values compared to a benchmark. Now, this is particularly important as you think about and as you prepare to do your group project, because these will be part of your group project for the two organizations that you will be comparing. A couple of different ratio analysis categories. The first one is profitability, and the question that gets asked there is the business generating sufficient profits? Okay, do we have enough profits to reinvest in our mission? For a nonprofit, that's particularly important because even though that they say they're nonprofit, they still want those income over expenses kind of things, and they want to be able to reinvest in their mission. All right, liquidity. Can the business meet its cash obligations? Cash obligations means debts that we owe. So we have to have the ability to pay our bills and staff on time. Debt management is the business using the right mix of debt and equity? We don't want to give too much of our equity away because then we dilute our ownership. And when that happens, you've got too many owners and too many people that you'd be responsible for. It's hard to make decisions, things like that. So we can use debt management. Asset management. Does the business have the right amount of assets for its patient volume? That helps us show leverage and efficiency. Like, do we need more equipment to do what we're trying to do? Or are we at the extent, are we optimized? Are we over leveraged for what we're trying to do with the small amount of resources that we have? Here are two profitability ratios. You have total margin formula and the operating margin formula. The total margin is your net income over your total revenues, both operating and non-operating. And so for Riverside, when you do the math, that math comes up to 7.5%. Okay. On the operating margin side, the formula is operating income over operating revenue. So this is not non-operating revenue or non-operating income. This is just operating, okay? Make sure that you're making that distinction. And here the example, the math turns out to be 3.1% margin, which in healthcare, that's actually pretty decent. Very, very common. Again, that ratio of value alone has little meaning, okay? Excuse me. Return on assets formula, that's your net income divided by your total assets. for Riverside, it's going to be 5.7%. So all of your income divided by the total value of all of your assets. What that tells us is, are we making enough money on the assets we own? Or are we making good income and revenue on the assets that we own? That's an indicator of, well, do we need to order new equipment? Do we need to get new assets or more assets? Or are we over leveraged and we have too many assets and we're not making as much as we should based on how much we have spent on total assets? Your return on equity, remember, equity is the portion that the owners own, their share of the ownership. And your return on equity formula is your net income divided by your total equity. So you have 100% total equity. You got to take that number and the value of that number, and you put net income over it, divide by that total equity, and that comes up with your return on equity. This is telling you how much money or how much income or revenue you're generating compared to the amount of equity that the ownership has. Again, profitability, liquidity, same thing. Here's these profitability ratios put in straight line formula, 2015 and 2016. Your total margin, 7.5%, 2016, and 2015 it was 2.3%. Your operating margin in 2016 was 3.1%, and in 2015 it was negative 2.2%. So something went bad wrong there that year, and they actually lost money in their operating margins that year. Your return on assets is 5.7 in 16, and in 2015 it was 1.6. That's good. They grew from 15 to 16 in that category. They recognized that, hey, we have a lot of assets and we're not really growing or we're not really doing what we could with our assets. So we need to do better with what we have. We need to have more income for what we own. Same thing on the equity, return on equity, your ROE, the 2016 number of 8.0% over the 2015 number of 2.4% shows that, hey, we've increased somewhere, somehow, okay? And in the context of just the notes, you don't know what they've done or where they've done it, but you do know that they have a better financial standing there. Now, in the green and under the industry line, those green numbers represent the industry standards, okay? Here's where your benchmarking kind of comes in. One of the benchmarks that companies typically use is the industry standard ratio, or the industry standard amount for that ratio across the entire healthcare industry. And so for total margins, 5%. Now, personally, I believe that's a little bit high. It may not be terribly high considering all the things that could go into total margins and non-operating margins, but your operating margins are 3.6% for the industry standard. And that is actually pretty close to normal. And over the last 5 years, we've seen since 2020, those numbers looked horrible because we had such a bad year, 2020 and 2021. But now since 2024, this year in 2025, and we anticipate in 2026, that those numbers will start to not only stabilize, but they will actually start to get better, and operating margins could come back up to some really good numbers. Your return on assets and your return on equity, same thing, benchmark industry standards are listed there in green. So looking at this this table here and trying to interpret it, what does it look like to you if you compare 2015 to 2016 and you compare those industry numbers? Is this business, is Riverside doing good? Are they doing fair? Are they doing poor? How would you rate that? How would you look at that, just comparing this and understanding what those numbers are, the total margin, operating margin, the return on assets, and return on equity, and as they comparatively look from 2016 to 2015, what they've done in the past to what they've done now, how does that look to you? To me, this looks like they're coming around. They're doing better, because if you look at their numbers in 2015, everything in 2015 went up in 2016, which is a good thing, especially on that operating margin where they were negative 2.2, okay? But if you also say, all right, we're going to look at what their 2016 is compared to industry, they're doing pretty good there, because in 3 of the categories, total margin, ROA, and ROE, they're actually, they're not in ROE, but total margin and ROA, they are actually above industry standard. They're a little bit below in operating margins compared to industry standards, but think of where they came from in 15 to 16. They've came up, 4.9% total. So they've grown 4.9% from 2015 to 2016. That's a pretty good growth rate, particularly when you look at the industry growth at 3.6%. I would anticipate that if you could forecast out or you could see out the actual 2017 numbers, all things staying the same, no other crazy variables popping in there, that they would look really good financially. Okay. We talk about liquidity ratios. Remember, liquidity is how quick we can turn everything into cash. So you have two different ratios here, current ratio and the days of cash on hand. Your current ratio is your current assets divided by your current liabilities. Real simple. You just take all your assets divided by all your liabilities, which are things that you owe, okay, and you get a value. This one is 2.3 times. You can drop the dollar sign on this because of algebraic rules. So $31,280 divided by $13,332 is 2.3. You drop the dollar sign there and get a 2.3 times current ratio. Your days of cash on hand, that's just simply how many days you have of cash availability on hand. In other words, if you were to stop receiving revenue, so no income, how many days could your business continue to operate without any new income? And that formula is cash plus short-term investments divided by your cash expenses divided by 365, which are days in the year, right? So for this one, when you do the math, they have 22.5 days of cash on hand. Again, I refer back to the pandemic and it kind of wants you to understand that when we were not getting revenues and things were really going crazy, but we were spending all this time and money and resources and effort on treating all the very, very sick patients, that really caused some days on cash hand to evaporate and disappear for a lot of companies, okay? But among average businesses, 30 days cash on hand is pretty average for the amount. Some businesses like to keep that. Some businesses like to keep less. Obviously, a conservative way to look at that would be the more days of cash on hand that you have, the longer you can go if revenues were to stop. However, if we think back to that, well, if we just have cash on hand, even in short-term investments, cash and short-term investments are not yielding any or not yielding very much interest. And so we talked about making our money work for us and the money just sitting over there in a corner in a pile. If it's not doing anything, it's not making any money for us. So having cash on hand just sitting is sort of a balance that operators need to work with. They don't want to have too much, but they also don't want to have too little, okay? And here is another table with those two ratios. Again, current ratio and your days of cash on hand. In 2016, Riverside was 2.3 times, and 2015 they were 1.7. So they increased their current ratio, which is good. And then their current days of cash on hand increased as well. Looking at those industry standards, a 2.0 current ratio is a good average number, and your days of cash on hand again is 30.6 is what's the industry average. It just depends on your industry and what your financial goals are. Remember, we always talk about those financial goals of the company. Your goal could be, we want to have 60 days of cash on hand or 45 days of cash on hand. It's not a bad idea to have that. Excuse me. Pardon. It's not a bad idea to have that much cash on hand as long as you're balancing it and your money is not sitting idle, not earning anything. So the interpretation here, again, just looking at those numbers, comparing 2015 to 2016 and then comparing them to the industry. Days of cash on hand for Riverside could be better. They've done a good job of bringing it up from 15 to 16, but their current ratio has come up quite a bit and they're actually above the ratio, which means they're headed in a really good direction here. Some debt management ratios, your debt ratio formula and your times interest earned ratio formula. Your debt ratio is your total debt divided by your total assets. That's pretty quick, pretty easy to do. Once you have a number for those, your total debt, divide that by your total assets and get 29.0% for Riverside. on your TIE or your times interest earned. It's your EBIT, okay, in balance before income and taxes, divided by your interest expense. I'm sorry, in balance before interest and taxes. Divided by your interest expense is 6.6. Basically, this is us making sure that we cover our debt liabilities. Make sure that we have enough revenues and enough cash to cover all of our debts. All right. Here's that table: debt ratio and times earned interest. 2015, their debt ratio was 33.5, and in 2016 it was 20.9. So, something went different here. They went down on this. All right. And when you look at the industry average for debt ratio, they're under the industry average, and that's there's something changed. Okay. So from 2015 to 2016, we had a decrease in debt ratio. So something is different, and when you compare that to the industry average, something changed. So they may have been doing something to make this happen, and your book will eventually give you the clues on what that is. In their times interest earned, their times interest earned from 15 to 16 was good. They went up 4 whole points, and that 4 whole point difference is the industry average. So, going up to 2.6 was a good thing. Note that debt ratio is capitalized ratio, whereas the TIE ratio is the coverage ratio. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. When you get a little deeper in this, again, it goes beyond the scope of this class, but just understanding what the debt ratio is, comparing it to year over year and benchmarking it to the industry. Same thing for the TIE. That is important, and students know that. Some more asset management ratios, your fixed asset turnover formula. So your fixed asset turnover formula, remember, fixed assets are something that's attached to the ground. You can't pick it up and move it, property, plant, and equipment, things like that. That ratio is your total revenues divided by your net fixed assets. All right, so you have what you've made divided by the value of your assets, and it's 0.95 for this year. Your total asset turnover is your total revenues divided by your total assets. So what we're doing here is taking out fixed assets and non-fixed assets to get a different ratio, and that is the total asset turnover formula there. You have total assets that you're looking at here, whereas in the fixed asset turnover formula, it was just your fixed assets, okay? So when they do the math there, they were 0.76 times. Okay, and you also have your average collection period formula. This is net patient accounts receivable. Okay, so what you're owed, what people owe you, divided by your net patient service revenue divided by days. Okay, so what you're owed by what you've made divided by days, which on this one it gives 75.7 days, which is it's kind of high. Okay, your average collection period, 75 days. You want that to be in the 21-day range, 21 to 25. Less than 30 is good. Think about it this way: if you have a average collection period of less than 30, but you've got 30 days of cash on hand, if your collections kind of dip or change, then you've got the cash on hand to cover your expenses with not more income revenue coming in. Okay, so that's important for us to say, okay, what's our days in patient accounts receivable, all right, or our average collection period. If that is less than your days of cash on hand, that is a strong financial position to be in, because again, if your revenue stopped, at least you could have the cash on hand to take care of your costs. If that changes and your patient average collection period is way higher and your revenue stops, then you may run out of money before you get more cash in, and that creates a huge problem. When you look at it on a table, your fixed asset turnover or your total asset turnover and your average collection period, you compare them from 2015 to 2016, you can see that there was some improvement there. Your average collection period went down. That's good. They were at 80.6 days, so they came down to 75.6, which is good. The industry standard is 60.4. That's pretty common because your insurance companies, your private payers, they like to drag out those days and make you wait on your pay. So the interpretation here is they're doing something right, they're doing something good, they've got their days in patient accounts receivable going down, their asset turnover ratio is coming up, which is good, and their fixed asset turnover rate, which is coming up, and that is good as well. Okay. Then we get into the DuPont analysis. This one is a little strange. It's out there. It's a heavy formula, but it's actually pretty important. It's a really good formula to determine kind of a overall analysis of where you are. Okay. So the DuPont analysis summarizes and highlights a business's total financial condition. All right. Based on return on equity, it's expressed into three different ratios: total margin, which tells you where you are with expense control. Are you containing your expenses? Okay, are you limiting how much your spend is? Then you have total asset turnover, which is, are you using your assets to make good revenue, also called asset utilization? And then your equity multiplier, your debt utilization. So are we using our debt, okay, to make more revenue? That's a goal. We want to use our debt to make more revenue, okay? You've probably heard that rich people use debt to make money, whereas poor people use assets to make money. Think of the difference again between, your car. You have a car, and to you feel like that's an asset because that's maybe one of the most expensive things you own. But if you're not using it like an Uber driver would be to make revenue, then it's not an asset. It's actually a liability. So it's not doing anything for you. But like an Uber driver, if they were using their car as an asset to make money, and we compare that to the debt utilization, are we using that car to make money in the right way? Is sort of the question that they ask themselves. Okay. So this DuPont analysis, it breaks the ROE into margin, efficiency, and leverage. Those are three big things that a business wants to know. What are our margins? Are we good? Are we profitable? Are we making enough money to put back into the company or to pay our shareholders or to reinvest? Are we efficient? Are we doing the best we could with what we have? And do we have the right financing set up in the leverage category so that we're not over leveraged, where our financing, the money that we've borrowed, has exceeded our capacity to pay it off? Okay. It reveals whether that strength comes from operations or from debt. And operations is where we want it to come from. Remember, if your main thing is the main thing, to make money doing the service that you provide, that's what you want to do. You don't want to make that money with total debt. We want to use the debt, but we also want to make sure that our strength comes from the operation. Okay. And it helps leaders choose where to focus improvement. Here's the DuPont analysis formula. It's total margin times total asset turnover rather, times your equity multiplier equals your return on equity. Okay. So your net income divided by your revenue divided by total assets, your total assets divided by total equity equals that. And for Riverside 2015, it was 2.4. 2016, it was 8. Okay, so again, they're coming. All right, here's a nice little video from Apple. This is the Apple organization from a couple years back, and they did a DuPont analysis on Apple.
How to perform a return on equity calculation and ROE analysis. This example takes you through the 2017 results of Apple Inc. and shows you both the math as well as the interpretation of the numbers. Stick around for the full discussion, as things become very interesting when you start to attach meaning to the numbers. What is the high-level formula for return on equity? Net income divided by equity. To find net income, you need to check the bottom line of the income statement. $48 billion for Apple in fiscal 2017. To find the equity number, you need to turn to the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Usually, the average of the starting and the ending equity number of the year is used. In the case of Apple, $131 billion. You divide the two numbers, and there's your ROE number of 37% for 2017. But what is driving that performance? What are its components? That's where the DuPont formula and DuPont analysis come in. The three-step DuPont ROE formula takes the high-level calculation and splits it into three sections: net income over sales, or return on sales, sales over assets, or asset turnover, assets over equity, or leverage. As you see, sales is both in the numerator as well as the denominator of the equation, so would disappear in the multiplication. The same goes for assets, which is also in both the numerator as well as the denominator of the equation. For analytical purposes, having the three sections is very useful, as you will soon see. Let's visit the income statement again to find the top line or sales number. Let's visit the balance sheet again, this time to find the assets number on the left-hand side of the balance sheet. Just like with equity, the convention is to take the average number, the starting and ending balance of assets for the year. Once you have filled in these numbers into the equation, you can calculate return on sales at 21%, asset turnover at 0.66, and leverage at 2.66. When you multiply these three components, you obviously get to the same 37% total ROE number that we started with. Having these numbers brings us back to the same question as before, at a more detailed level. What is driving that performance? Let's go from left to right through the three components. 21% return on sales sounds high, as my reference is delivering training at companies that have an ROS in the 10% to 15% range. We can drill down another level and dive into the components of return on sales. For that, we need a few more numbers from the income statement. We already looked up net income and sales. We will now also use operating income, or EBIT, and income before provision for income taxes, or EBT, in our calculations. Let's fill in those numbers into the three sections that make up ROS. Net income over earnings before taxes, which is called tax burden, is 75%, which means that Apple's effective tax rate in 2017 is 25%. Fairly low, but not unusual for a multinational company that is known for optimizing its tax planning. Earnings before taxes over earnings before interest and taxes, which is called interest burden, is 104%. This is fairly unusual, as for most companies, earnings before taxes would be lower than earnings before interest and taxes. At Apple, the interest and dividend income is higher than the interest expense. Therefore, earnings before taxes is higher than earnings before interest and taxes. Lastly, and this is where we get to the operational metric of EBIT margin, EBIT over sales is 27%, which is high. When you multiply these three components, you obviously get to the same 21% total ROS number that we started with. Zoom out from the ROS detail to the three-step DuPont ROE formula. The second component, asset turnover of 0.66, how does that stack up? For 2016, I have looked into the asset turnover of two other well-known companies, telecom and media company Verizon and retailer Walmart. The capital-intensive Verizon has an asset turnover of 0.52, by the denominator of assets that includes huge numbers for wireless licenses, plant, property and equipment, and goodwill. Retailer Walmart has an asset turnover of 2.42, as asset velocity is the name of the game in retail. That leads us to the question, what is going on in Apple's asset turnover? To answer that question, let's turn to the line items of the left-hand side of the balance sheet. Apple has a huge amount of cash, as well as short-term and long-term marketable securities. On average for 2017, the sum of those three is $253 billion, or 73% of the total assets. So what is dragging down the asset turnover ratio is an unusually high number of financial assets, rather than the operating assets of the company. That brings us to the last of the three items, leverage. 2.66 is not an unusual number, but you can't really conclude much about this, as a potential distribution of the financial assets to shareholders through dividends, as well as using the money to pay down debt, would significantly impact both the numerator as well as the denominator of the leverage equation. Who knows what a normalized leverage ratio would look like for Apple? I hope this video was useful both in understanding the math of the DuPont ROE formula, as well as the interpretation of the numbers through DuPont analysis. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this ROE example, then please give it a thumbs up. On this end screen, there are a few suggestions of videos you can watch next. Please subscribe to the Finance Storyteller YouTube channel. Thank you. How to perform